Happy 70th birthday, Dad. The Sterling Grand Hotel ballroom was a sea of black ties and silk gowns glittering under chandeliers that cost more than my first apartment. Champagne flowed like water, and the air smelled of expensive perfume and entitlement. I stood near the back, nursing a glass of sparkling water, watching my father, Richard Sterling, take the stage. He looked every inch the titan of industry, tan fit, and radiating the kind of arrogance only decades of unchecked power can buy. Beside him stood my brother Connor, 35 years old, vice president of brand vision, whatever that meant, and wearing a tuxedo that probably cost $10,000. My mother Susan beamed from the front row, clapping her hands like a seal. The room hushed as Richard tapped the microphone. "Thank you all for coming," he boomed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. 70 years. It makes a man think about legacy, about the future. He paused for dramatic effect, placing a hand on Connor's shoulder. "That is why tonight I am proud to announce that effective immediately, I am stepping down as CEO of Sterling Hospitality Group. And the torch passes to my son Connor." Applause erupted. Polite, enthusiastic applause from people who didn't know the truth. I didn't clap. I didn't even blink. "But we haven't forgotten everyone," Richard continued, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on me. A cruel smile played on his lips. "Gabrielle, come up here, sweetheart." I walked to the stage, my heels clicking on the marble floor. The room watched the dutiful daughter approach the throne. Richard handed me a sleek white envelope. "For my brilliant daughter," he said into the mic loud enough for the back row to hear. "Since the men are handling the heavy lifting now, I thought you could use a break. A luxury spa package. Relax, find yourself a husband. You've earned it." The crowd laughed. A ripple of amusement at the expense of the little sister. Connor smirked, leaning into the mic. "Don't worry, Gab. I'll make sure the company is still here when you get back from your massage." I took the envelope. I looked at my father, then at my brother. And in that moment, the last shred of loyalty I had for this family evaporated. It wasn't anger I felt. It was clarity. Cold, sharp, absolute clarity. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I didn't cry. I didn't storm off the stage in a fit of humiliated tears. That's what they expected. That's what the old Gabrielle would have done. Instead, I smiled. It was a smile that didn't reach my eyes, a smile made of ice and steel. "Thank you, Dad," I said, my voice steady and amplified by the microphone. "I actually have a gift for you, too." I signaled to the waiter I'd tipped earlier. He walked onto the stage carrying a heavy box wrapped in deep blue velvet. Richard looked confused, but his ego wouldn't let him show it. He loved gifts. He reached for the box, expecting a watch, maybe a rare bottle of scotch. "You shouldn't have," he said, untying the ribbon. "Oh, but I should," I replied softly. "Happy birthday. I got you a comfortable retirement." He opened the lid. The smile froze on his face. It wasn't a watch. It was a stack of legal documents, thick and bound in leather. On top sat a single sheet of paper with the letterhead of a major law firm. The room went dead silent. You could hear the ice melting in the champagne buckets. Richard picked up the paper, his hands starting to tremble. "What is this?" he whispered the mic, picking up the tremor in his voice. "That," I said, leaning in close so only he and Connor could see the cold fire in my eyes, "is a formal notification of a hostile takeover. As of this morning, I control 52.4% of Sterling Hospitality's voting shares." And that document underneath. That's a notice for an emergency board meeting. Tomorrow morning. 8 a.m. Attendance is mandatory. Connor laughed a nervous, high-pitched sound. "You're crazy. You can't buy a company with a spa voucher, Gab." I turned to him, my expression blank. "I didn't buy it with a voucher, Connor. I bought it with the debt you two have been hiding for 3 years. I own the bank loans, I own the vendor liens, and now I own you." Richard dropped the box. Papers spilled onto the stage, white sheets scattering like feathers. The guests were murmuring now, realizing this wasn't a skit. This was an execution. "You ungrateful little." Richard started, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. "Careful, Dad," I cut him off. "Stress is bad for people in your position. Enjoy the party. It's the last one the company is paying for." I turned and walked off the stage, leaving them standing in the wreckage of their own arrogance. I didn't look back. I walked straight through the crowd, past the stunned investors, past the whispering socialites, and out the double doors. The cool night air hit my face, and for the first time in 32 years, I didn't feel like the spare air. I felt like the queen. But this wasn't a sudden move. This wasn't a tantrum. This was the result of 3 years of being underestimated, overlooked, and erased. They thought I was just the accountant, the girl who crunched numbers in the back office while they played golf. They didn't realize that when you control the numbers, you control the world. And I had been counting every single mistake they made. To understand why I just destroyed my family on a live stream, you have to understand the meeting that happened 3 years ago. It was a Tuesday. I sat in Richard's office, the air conditioner humming too loud, a 50-page binder resting on my lap. I called it the Sterling Survival Protocol. At 29, I was already a senior forensic accountant for a top-tier firm in Chicago, cleaning up messes for Fortune 500 companies. But for my father, I worked for free. I had spent 6 months analyzing the Sterling hospitality books, and what I found was a hemorrhage. The company was bleeding cash. Occupancy was down 45%. The debt-to-equity ratio was catastrophic. I had mapped out a complete restructuring plan. I found $2.3 million in recoverable tax liabilities and a way to refinance the vendor loans that would save the business from insolvency within 18 months. It was brilliant. It was bulletproof. It was the only way out. Richard sat behind his desk, scrolling through his phone. Connor was playing with a Newton's cradle in the corner, the click-clack echoing in the silence. I finished my presentation. "Dad," I said, "if we don't execute this by the third quarter, the banks will call the loans. We lose the flagship hotel." Richard didn't even open the binder. He slid it back across the mahogany desk like it was a coaster. "You worry too much, Gabrielle," he said, giving me that indulgent smile he reserved for children and waitstaff. "You're an accountant. You see pennies. I see the vision. You lack the killer instinct." He stood up and walked over to Connor, clapping him on the back. "Connor here has a new idea for a branding partnership with an influencer agency. That's the future. Big picture stuff. Not tax liabilities." Connor grinned, having contributed absolutely nothing to the meeting or the company in his entire life. "Yeah, Gab." That was the moment. The glass cliff. But it wasn't just sexism. I realized something deeper as I looked at my father's face. He didn't reject my plan because it was bad. He rejected it because it was right. See, a narcissist doesn't want a partner. They want a mirror. Connor was the perfect mirror, hollow, shiny, and reflecting Richard exactly as he wanted to be seen, a visionary king with a golden air. I wasn't a mirror. I was a microscope. I saw the rot, the debt, the lies. And when you look at a narcissist through a microscope, they don't see your competence. They see a threat. My intelligence didn't make him proud. It made him feel small. And Richard Sterling would burn his entire empire to the ground before he let a woman make him feel small. I stood up. I didn't argue. I didn't beg him to read the report. I picked up my binder, my useless math, and walked out. I stopped being his daughter in that elevator ride down to the lobby. I became an investor. I realized then that if I wanted a seat at the table, I couldn't ask for it. And lucky for me, Richard was so busy staring at his reflection in Connor, he didn't notice he was selling the furniture to pay for the frame. I took my knowledge of those toxic loans, the ones he ignored, and I went shopping. Back at the party, the chaos had moved from the ballroom to the coat room. It was the only place private enough for a screaming match. Richard had practically dragged me in there, his face a mask of purple rage. Susan was weeping into a silk handkerchief while Connor leaned against a rack of fur coats, trying to look bored but failing. His hands were shaking. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Susan wailed. "This was your father's night. The press is out there. The board members are out there. You're ruining the family image over what jealousy?" "It's not jealousy, Mom," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "It's business." Richard scoffed. "Business? You think handing me a stack of papers makes you a CEO? You're hysterical, Gabrielle. You're upset because you didn't get the big chair, so you're throwing a tantrum. It's embarrassing." "You can't buy a company with a spa voucher, sis," Connor sneered. "We'll have our lawyers look at whatever garbage you printed out. By Monday, this will all be a funny story we tell at the club." I looked at them. Really looked at them. There was no fear. No realization, just the absolute unshakable belief that they were untouchable and I was irrelevant. They honestly thought I was bluffing. That was the green light. That was the permission structure I needed to burn it all down. "I didn't buy the company with a voucher, Connor," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "And I didn't buy shares on the open market. That would have been too expensive." I walked over to Richard. "See, Dad, when you ignored my restructuring plan 3 years ago, I realized something. You didn't just have a cash flow problem. You had a reputation problem. You stopped paying your vendors, you stiffed your contractors. You leveraged the company's assets to buy your yacht and your third vacation home. There were a lot of angry people holding sterling debt. People who were desperate to get anything back. I pulled a small notebook from my clutch. So I made some calls. I found the construction firm you owe $2 million to. I found the linen suppliers you haven't paid in 6 months. I found the silent investors you ghosted. And I bought their debt, for pennies on the dollar. Because unlike you, they trusted me. They knew I was the only one who could actually turn this ship around. Richard stopped laughing. You can't do that. I did, I said. And because the company is in default on those loans which you hid from the board, by the way, I have the right to convert that debt into equity. As of this morning, those conversions are processed. I didn't just buy your company, Dad. I foreclosed on your ego. The silence in the coat room was heavy, suffocating. Connor looked at Richard. Dad, is that true? Richard didn't answer. He was staring at me like I was a stranger. Like he was seeing me for the first time in his life. And he was terrified. I wasn't done. The debt gave me leverage. But leverage is just a tool for negotiation. I didn't want to negotiate. I wanted to terminate. You think this is about bad loans? I asked, my voice barely a whisper in the stifling heat of the coat room. Bad loans are civil. What I found 6 months ago, that's criminal. I saw Connor flinch, a tiny involuntary spasm near his eye. He knew. While I was buying up your debt, I continued, I did a deep dive into the operational expenses. Specifically, the marketing and consultant budget. It was bloated, $40,000 a month going to a firm called Apex Solutions in Nevada. For brand strategy. I stepped closer to Connor. He smelled like expensive scotch and fear. I pulled the incorporation papers for Apex Solutions, Connor. It's a shell company. No employees, no website, just a P.O. box in Las Vegas. And do you know who the registered agent is? Your college roommate? Susan gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Connor, what is she talking about? It gets better, I said, turning to my father. I traced the transactions. The money went from sterling accounts to Apex and then directly to 3 offshore sports betting sites and a private creditor in Macau. You weren't spending $40,000 a month on marketing, Connor. You were paying off gambling debts. Connor looked at the floor, his face pale. It was a temporary cash flow issue. I was going to put it back. That's embezzlement, Connor, I said. That's 15 years in federal prison. But here is the part that actually broke me. Here is the part that made me decide to take the company instead of just fixing it. I looked Richard dead in the eye. I found the approval signatures on those wire transfers. You signed them, Dad. You knew. You knew he was stealing from the company, stealing from the shareholders, from the employees, from me, and you signed off on it as marketing expenses to cover his tracks. Richard stayed silent, his jaw clenched tight. He didn't deny it. He couldn't. You protected the thief because he was your son, I said, letting the disgust saturate every word. And you fired the fixer because she was your daughter. That was your mistake. Because now I have the forensic audit, I have the bank records, I have the proof of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. I reached into my purse and pulled out a single USB drive. I held it up. It caught the light like a bullet. This drive contains the entire file, I said. By 8 a.m. tomorrow this goes to the SEC and the FBI. Unless you do exactly what I say. You wouldn't, Susan whispered. He's your brother. He's your father. You wouldn't send them to jail. Try me, I said. I've spent 3 years being invisible to you people. You have no idea what I'm capable of. The next morning, the Sterling Hospitality boardroom was colder than a morgue. The heavy oak table polished to a mirror shine reflected the gray Chicago sky outside. The board members, 7 old men who had played golf with my father for 30 years, sat in uneasy silence. They had received my emergency summons at midnight. They knew something was wrong, but they didn't know the empire had already fallen. I sat at the head of the table. My father's chair. At 8 a.m. sharp, the double doors opened. Richard walked in. He was wearing a fresh suit, his hair perfectly coiffed, trying to project the image of the untouchable king. Connor walked a step behind him, looking like a ghost. Gentlemen, Richard boomed, forcing a smile. I apologize for this irregularity. My daughter seems to be under the impression that... Sit down, Richard, I said. I didn't shout. I didn't raise my voice. I just spoke with the absolute authority of the person holding the gun. One of the board members, Mr. Henderson, cleared his throat. Richard Gabriel has provided us with documentation regarding significant ownership changes, and some concerning financial irregularities. Richard froze. He looked at me. I tapped the laptop in front of me. The projector screen behind me lit up. It wasn't a slide deck. It was the gambling ledger, pages of wire transfers, betting slips, and Richard's signature authorizing the cover-up. This, I addressed the board, as evidence of systematic embezzlement and fraud, totaling $1.4 million over 3 years. Authorized by the CEO. Executed by the VP of Brand Vision. The room erupted. Shouts of, "Is this true, and my God, Richard?" I stood up. The noise died down instantly. I have acquired 52.4% of the voting shares through the purchase of distressed debt converted to equity, I stated calmly. I am the majority shareholder. I am moving for the immediate termination of Richard Sterling and Connor Sterling for cause. Effective immediately. "You can't do this," Connor screamed, his voice cracking. "Dad, tell them." Richard slumped into the nearest chair. He looked at the screen. He looked at the board members who were now looking at him with a mixture of horror and fury. He realized there was no spin that could fix this. "I have a proposal," I said, looking down at my father. "Option A, you and Connor are terminated for cause. I hand this digital file to the federal authorities waiting in the lobby. You leave here in handcuffs and the Sterling name becomes synonymous with fraud." Richard flinched. "Option B," I continued. "You both resign immediately. Citing health reasons. You surrender your remaining equity to the company to cover the embezzled funds. You sign NDAs. And you walk out of here. No pension. No severance. But no prison." The silence stretched for 10 seconds. 10 seconds that ended a dynasty. "Please," Richard whispered. It was the first time I had ever heard him beg. "Gabrielle, think about the family reputation." I looked at the man who had given me a spa voucher while handing his kingdom to a thief. I looked at the man who had erased me for 32 years. "The reputation is dead, Dad," I said, closing the laptop with a final snap. "I'm just burying the body." Richard signed the resignation papers with a shaking hand. He didn't look at me. He walked out of the boardroom, a broken old man leaning on his criminal son for support. As the door clicked shut, I sat back in the leather chair. It was comfortable. It fit perfectly. It has been 6 months since I walked out of that boardroom. The transition was brutal, efficient, and absolute. Richard and Susan retired to a 2-bedroom condo in Boca Raton. It is a nice condo. I pay for it. I also control their monthly stipend. It is enough to play golf and drink margaritas, but not enough to buy influence or launch a counterattack. I keep them comfortable, but I keep them contained. They call sometimes, usually when the allowance runs low, but I have an assistant who handles that. I don't speak to them. I can't. Connor is in a rehabilitation center in Malibu. I paid for that too. Not because I forgive him, but because it was the cleanest way to remove him from the board without a messy public trial. He signed over his remaining equity in exchange for avoiding prison. He sends me letters, sometimes rambling about how he's finding himself. I archive them without reading. I stand on the balcony of the penthouse suite at the Sterling Grand. The city lights of Chicago stretch out below me like a grid of diamonds. The air is cold, sharp, and clean. This is the view Richard loved. This is the view he thought belonged to him by divine right. Now it belongs to the daughter he tried to buy off with a spa voucher. But here is the truth nobody tells you about winning. Here is the price of the crown. It is quiet up here. A heavy, thick silence that presses against your eardrums. When you cut off the people who share your DNA, you don't just lose the toxicity, you lose your history. You lose the people who remember you as a child. You become an orphan by choice. There are nights when I look at my phone and feel the phantom limb of my family. I wonder if I was too harsh. I wonder if I could have fixed it without burning it down. But then, I remember the coat room. I remember the laughter when I was handed that envelope. I remember 3 years of being invisible while I saved their empire. And I realize that the silence isn't loneliness, it's peace. It is the sound of no longer having to beg for a seat at the table. It is the sound of dignity. I didn't lose a family. I escaped a cult of personality. I built my own table carved from the wreckage of their ego, and while it might be a table for one right now, at least I know I earned the chair. I take a sip of my wine, a vintage Richard had been saving for his diamond jubilee. It tastes like victory. If you have ever had to build your own table because they wouldn't give you a seat, share this story. Let's remind the world that worth is built, not inherited.